Hey everybody, Mr. Wineland here, recording chapter 14, section 1, talking about the nation's sick economy. I'm kind of going through this for those who have not gotten any of this. We've been talking about the 1920s and kind of going through some of the troubles of the 1920s economically. We hadn't really touched on, but we were talking about some positives, but ultimately we're going to talk about those problems that will occur economically. The 1920s was very prosperous. People were celebrating, having a good time. There was a lot of wealthy people, a lot of individuals who were having success during this time. But we're going to see that farmers are struggling during this time with their crops, with their livestock, unable to make a profit. And biggest problem is that a lot of consumers were not buying their products, and so a lot of farmers, put a lot of money deep into debt, thinking if they grew more, maybe that would help end some of their problems. But obviously, that would not occur. So that would be a big issue. We also see it wasn't just farmers that are struggling as well. We're seeing that there's a lot of other textile industries like clothing are struggling as well. The railroads are struggling. Steel are struggling to make a profit. And part of this has to do with the fact that World War I ended, and early on in the 1920s they were doing okay. Demand was still high, but there was now too much supply and not meeting enough demand. And so that becomes a big of an issue because they think, well, demand's going to be super high, so we're just going to keep making more and more and more, grow more and more and more. Well, problem is demand starts gradually going down. So that's going to hurt its ability to have a profit. We're also going to see mining and lumbering struggle as well. Their ability to make a profit. There's not too much building needing. There's not much coal that's needed, as well as new technologies are happening, new fuels, natural gas is making its way. Also, railroads are going to struggle because of the automobile industry, which that's going to hurt. Even automobile structure struggle too. We're seeing too many automobiles put on the market, and that's going to ultimately hurt as well. Then you're going to see, housing is going to shortfalls, and then that's going to end up hurting in just other industries like furniture. So that becomes problematic. So we see that during World War One, the price rose. International demand of crops such as wheat and corn. The demand fell after the war. So the thing is, things were high when the World War One, but things are going to go down afterwards and drop by 40% in farming. Farmers again, they put too much money into this. They think, hey, let's add more money and maybe that will help. And so we see between 1919 and 1921, annual farm income declined from 10 billion to 4 billion. Some of these farmers are struggling to pay off loans, so they're foreclosing and seeing banks basically take their property, and they're ultimately absorbing their debt. And that's going to be problematic for some banks, especially rural banks who can't take on those costs. We see auctions were held to recoup some of the bank losses. We're seeing Congress tries to step in with the McNair-Hogan bill. The idea was to supplement food prices, provide some support to these farmers. Basically saying like, hey, when it came to wheat, corn, cotton, tobacco, like we're going to give you a surplus, okay, on crops. We'll pay you to not farm. Basically, is kind of what they were going for, or at least give you some government funding. But the problem is Coolidge didn't like this. He killed the bill twice by vetoing it. And saying farmers have never made money. I don't believe we can do much about it. Thinking like this is not going to be beneficial to America. But what he doesn't understand is actually it's going to be helpful to America, because if the farmers can pay their bills, it's going to help the banks. And then ultimately it's going to help America from defaulting. And that becomes problematic, though, in the future, as we're going to learn when Coolidge is not president. So a big mistake by Coolidge. As farmers' incomes fell, we see that fewer goods and services were out there, which that became a little bit more of a problem. By the late 1920s, you see Americans were buying less, mainly because of rising prices. So this becomes an issue. Also, credit, having too much credit becomes a problem. And we're seeing with the production, this is going to hurt as far as with wages, as well as causing more of a gap between the rich and the poor, and be problematic. Your definition for credit's here in blue. If you need a pause, you can. But Americans appeared to be prosperous during the 1920s. In fact, they were living beyond their means, and it primarily is because of credit. Credit is ultimately, it has some good. Look, I'm not going to lie. Credit is got some good to it. The thing is, it can help somebody who's in a pinch. I don't have money now, so I need to pay for it now in some way, and I'll pay later if I have to. And that's usually what it's mean for. But the problem is it gets kind of abused. Instead of being like, hey, we really need a refrigerator, okay, or we really need an automobile because we got to get to our jobs, or we got to drop Junior off at school. So that made sense to use credit. Where it becomes a bigger problem is when you start to see other businesses use credit to entice people to take on more credit, which is installment plans. And these are still going on today. I mean, you see it on advertisement. Well, for only $17 a month, you can have this nice mattress with this bed frame and you're going to sleep comfortably. Okay, yeah, I mean, $17 a month, that's not bad. But what they don't tell you is the high interest that you're taking on from that $17 a month. And look, I'm not saying I haven't ever done an installment plan. I've done installment plans, but I've tried to pay them off as quickly as I could because I knew the high interest rates. And so a lot of times what I've done with those installment plans is, I've gotten 12 months of 0% interest and basically making sure that, hey, I drop, as much as I can. I know they would have your monthly payment is only $82 this month. And you want to make sure you made the monthly payment because if you don't, then they would tack on interest. But I would try to pay more so that way I could, pay it off with, having to pay any interest. So everything goes towards the principal. But this ultimately encourages more consumers to go into debt, and that's problematic. So we see this is ultimately going to have individuals have a hard time paying off this debt. So you're seeing more than 70% of the nation's families earn less than $2,500 per year. So a lot of them really couldn't afford to take on credit. Even families, my bad. Even families earning twice that much could not afford many of the household products that are being manufactured. So this becomes a big problem. Economists estimate that an average man or woman bought a new outfit or clothes only once a year. Half the homes in many cities had electric lights or a furnace for heat. Only one city home in 10 had electric refrigerators. So you're seeing that electric lights and electricity is making its way out to people a lot more, but it's still not fast enough. This is still kind of causing some unequal distribution throughout American society throughout the 1920s. A lot of people did not have money to purchase a flood of goods in the factories. So this, we're seeing a lot of families are taking on things that they're not ready for. Your definitions for Alfred E. Smith and Herbert Hoover here, you want to write that Herbert Hoover was the Republican candidate for the election of 1928, and then Alfred E. Smith was a Democratic candidate for the election of 1928. So we see that the election in 1928 is going to be key. Coolidge is not running for re-election, even though he could justify serving out another term because he only did 2 years of Harding's term, and he got re-elected for another term. He could have done another term and not have to do the two-term tradition that George Washington. But by the way, during this time in the 1920s, I want to say it's the 27th. I don't think it's the 27th Amendment. It's not the 27th. It's the 23rd. I want to say it's the 23rd Amendment. The 23rd Amendment. The amendment, either one. The amendment that was put on the books to limit the president's terms hadn't been set yet with And so at this point, Coolidge could have ran for president as long as he wanted to. But, there was this tradition that, established since George Washington. If you got reelected for another term, you only served out 2 terms, 2 full terms. And technically Coolidge could have gotten reelected for another term and people would have been fine with it. But he decided, I'm done. I'm done being president. I'm going to move on. So Hoover, he's very successful. Hoover, has some success under the Secretary of Commerce, under Harding and Coolidge. Was a mining engineer from Iowa who had never run for public office. Smith was very much a career politician who basically had a lot of success as governor of New York. And so he was, a little bit more out there to that of the reserved Hoover. Hoover was kind of like, I don't want to be in the limelight. I'm just want to show people I can be president, but I'm not here to be your friend. The one thing that Hoover had over Smith is that the Republican Party was very popular at this time in the 1920s. And there was a lot of success with the Republican Party. Even with Harding and his problems, the Republican Party had a lot of positives going for them in the 1920s. So a lot of people were like, yeah, let's stick with Republican leadership. Of course we want to go with Hoover. Not seeing what was going to happen in 1929, which was the crash of the stock market. And this is ultimately going to hurt Hoover, as we'll learn. By 1929, we start to see economists are really setting out the warning, like, look, the market is not strong. The economy is not good. People aren't buying goods like they were early on in the 1920s. So we really want to really just people understand the health of the economy is not good. The confidence is not good. In increasing numbers, you could see that those who could actually afford to invest in the stock market became the most visible symbol of prosper America. We're seeing those who can actually spend the money for the stock market are starting to make their money and really come ahead with this. And so we see that the Dow Jones Industrial Average was one of the most widely used barometers of the stock market health, kind of measured at this time. And what it is you have 30 stocks that represent 30 representative large firms in the New York Stock Exchange, in what is called the Dow Jones. And so the Dow Jones basically, it's like a top 25 ranking, like the AP top 25 in college football. You kind of get an idea basically where do these teams stand as far as being the best team in the nation. And basically they take the top 30 stocks, and I believe like Walmart's on there, Amazon, I want to say, is on there. I think Microsoft is on there. And they basically and Apple, I believe, as well. And they kind of take those stocks and they kind of do an inflate. They take their stock price and inflate it to a certain level of gains, and basically it kind of shows whether or not the stock market's healthy. And so it's kind of a barometer. And most of the time people are like, oh no, the Dow's down. Oh, but a lot of people, not back then, but now they have the S&P 500, which is basically like the Dow, but it has more stocks. It has 500 more stocks on this ranking system, which I would say is more like the college football playoff ranking, which actually gives you a much accurate picture of who really is the best team and who should be playing for the top spot, because they actually have it ranked from 1 to 500. And I believe Apple is number 1 in the S&P 500. But my mom would, she was a financial advisor for a long time, and, clients would be calling, the Dow's down, the Dow's down. My mom would be like, yeah, we don't look at the Dow. We look at the S&P 500. It's fine. It's down a little, but it's not too bad. But back then, the Dow was kind of it for the New York Stock Exchange. So most of the 1920 stock prices were definitely on the rise. The Dow was just reaching higher limits, 381 points, nearly 300 points higher than had been 5 years earlier. But people were wondering, the bull market is hot. Okay, the bull market is when things are rising. The bear market is when things are sleeping, not doing so well. So there was a lot of concern about, too many people are buying stocks and bonds. And so in 1929, about 4 million Americans, or 3% of the nation's population, had owned stock. And so there's a lot of concern about the health of the economy. And so it really becomes concerning of what's going to happen. Things are growing too fast. And so we see buying on the margin right here is all in blue. So too many investors were already wealthy, but there's average Americans who are also trying to strike it rich and investing in the stock market. And some were able to be successful. Some shouldn't have been in there. And people were engaging in speculation, thinking that, hey, if I buy a stock or a bond, there's a chance I can earn a profit, which that's fine, but sometimes it didn't work out too well, especially if you didn't know what you were doing. And too many people were buying on the margin, paying a small percentage of stock price as down payment and borrowing the rest with easy money available to the investors. The unrestrained buying and selling fueled the market's upward spiral, which this is happening. People are using credit to buy these stocks and then hopefully sell them for a profit. The government did little to discourage such buying and regulate the market, and they're kind of like, let them have their fun. But the problem is these rising prices did not reflect what the company was worth. It's basically saying, okay, well, this company, it's like GameStop. Recently that's been in the news. Based on the GameStop stock price, a few weeks ago, it was valued as a multi-billion-dollar company. Well, if you really look at the sheets, the business structure and its books, what they're not making any money right now. They're struggling. They're in the red. They're losing money, and so it's not even close to $1 million. I mean, it's $1 million industry, but very low. And so people, buying these stocks, we had what ended up happening. If you didn't hear the news, is some people were doing kind of like the buying on the margin strategy. These hedge funds, which have this big number of money and value, basically what they did was they borrowed the stock. Okay, they borrowed a stock, which basically they were loaned money, a certain amount of money based on the number of stocks that they took out. They were given that money for credit, and then they had to buy at least the shares back, and they bet on the shares going down. So all they had to do is give some of that money back based on the stock price eventually at a certain point in time. And so they were bet when they took out the loan, it was at a much higher rate. And then when they were hoping that the stock would go down to like $5 and they would buy it, the number of shares they took out at $5, and they would earn a big margin of profit. Well, and that group found out about that, and they basically took a lot of their money and they invested in GameStop and, forced the stock to go up, and up, basically by buying the price. And then, so instead of these hedge funds buying this stock at $4, they had to go buy it at $350 a share. And that's just crazy. So they lost money. And that really caused a problem in our own stock market. And luckily, it wouldn't cause a crash. Luckily, we're a little bit more stable than what we were back in 1929. But back in 1929, that's what ended up happening, is that the worst thing would happen is that because these stocks did not reflect the value of the company itself, it would ultimately cause problems. We see that eventually these stocks would decline and people could not pay off their loans. And this would cause what is called a big crash. In September of 1929, stock prices peaked and then fell, and the confidence of the market would start to plummet. On October 24th, the market took a big plunge. This caused panic investors to basically sell off a lot of stock, which led on October 29th, known as Black Tuesday. Their answer number 2. The bottom fell out basically under the stock market, and we see that the confidence was shot. Shareholders frantically tried to sell before prices plunged even lower. We see they dumped that day a record of 16.4 million different stocks or shares. Additional millions of shares could not find buyers, and so people were out of money, basically had to take on the debt. And they could not pay back their loans. By mid-November, you're seeing investors had lost about $30 billion, amount equal to how much Americans spent in World War I. So the stock market bubble burst that day, and it really sent us into a spin. So number 1 is 1940. So the stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, the period from 1929 to 1940, in which the economy plummeted and unemployment skyrocketed. The crash alone did not cause the Great Depression, but it did help make things worse with the economy. And so after the crash, we see a lot of panic. People, running to the banks to withdraw their money. This ultimately created bank runs, which is, when somebody takes money and then they tell, hey, you better get your money before they run out. And then several mothers come in, and then eventually the bank runs out of money and they had to close. And so in 1929, you see 600 banks closed. By 1933, 11,000 of the 25,000 banks had failed. And that's a massive failure. Because the government did not protect or insure the bank accounts, millions of people lost their savings accounts. So we see Great Depression hit other businesses between 1929 and 1932. We see gross national product, which is the nation's total output of goods and services, was cut nearly in half from 104 billion to 59 billion, and approximately 90,000 businesses went bankrupt. 25% is your answer number 3 there. Among these failed enterprises were the automobile and railroad industries. Nobody could afford to buy a car, and people weren't traveling because, didn't have money to go travel. As the economy plunged into tailspin, millions of workers lost their jobs. Unemployment went from 3%, so 1.6 million workers, to in 1929 to 25%. 13 million workers in 1933. So it was pretty bad. And one out of every 4 workers was out of a job. That was mostly men. Some were able to keep their jobs, but their hours were reduced. Not everyone fared so well during this time. But some were able to, some were able to, have some success. John F. Kennedy's dad, Joseph P. Kennedy, was able to buy out at the right time, and that's part of the reason why they were pretty wealthy. I mean, it wasn't just the mafia. These rumors about, the mafia, they gave them a lot of money. It was more than that. But anyway, it definitely helped. So the United States was not the only country gripped with the Great Depression. By the way, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act is right here. We see other countries around the world struggled. Europe struggled. A lot of debts had to be paid. Germany still had to pay their war debts from World War I. We see that Great Depression really hurt the ability to import European goods. Difficult to sell American farm products and manufactured goods abroad, so exporting. So by 1930, Congress passed what they called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. The idea was to protect their American businesses by charging more taxes to Europe. It was to protect them from foreign competition, the farmers and the American manufacturers, but unfortunately did the opposite effect. It actually hurt us from selling anything to our European confidants. So by reducing the flow of goods to the United States, the tariff prevented other countries from earning American currency to buy American goods, and the tariff made unemployment worse, which made things worse for Europe. And many countries retaliated also with their own tariffs, and we see that trade fell by 40%. Your answer number 5 is everything in blue right here. You might have to pause to write it all, but the Great Depression was more than just the stock market. The reason why economists, they'll point out some of the main causes were more than just the stock market. One was the tariffs and the war debts from World War I that really hurt with American goods and their markets. The crisis of the farm sector, not able to, not passing that bill by Congress, really hurt the ability to help the American farmer and keep their farms. The availability of easy credit, that to me, too many people use credit, didn't need to use credit. And that caused problems, and unequal distribution of income also hurt as well. These factors led to the falling demand of consumer goods. The federal government contributed to the crisis, keeping interest rates low, thereby allowing companies and individuals to borrow easily and build up larger debts. Some of this borrowed money was used to buy stocks that later led to a crash, and by November 1929, President Hoover encouraged Americans to remain confident about the economy, but we're going to see that it's probably one of the worst depressions, or the worst depression in not just American history, but possibly world history. So it definitely is not going to go well for Hoover, and we'll kind of learn more about that in the next sections. All right.